Welcome, everyone. We're about to get started soon with the Lunch and Learn of Hidden Histories Society. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge with deep gratitude that we live, create, teach, and benefit on the territory of the Kwanlin Dun and the Ton Quechan Nation. So without further ado, in just one moment, I'm going to introduce Paul Gotti and Charlotte Renchuk with the Hidden Histories Society. Lunch and Learns are something that we do about once a month at Uconstruct, and they're only possible because we have support from the community to be able to do events like this. So thank you to Charlotte and Paul, and without further ado, here they are. All right, you guys are on.
Okay.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for the introduction.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi, Paul. So, as he said, we are members of the Hidden Histories Society Yukon, and let's see where to begin. We started in about the year 2000, 2001, and it's a personal story for me because my husband and I adopted three black children, and when they went to school, there was absolutely nothing that reflected them in the school or the curriculum or anything they were learning. They were among the very few black people in this community at that time. So I thought, sure, you know, my husband works on the Chilkoot Trail, and I thought, surely to heavens, I mean, the world came over the trail in 1898. Surely there were black people who came over the trail too. There must be some history here that we could, you know, have reflected in the schools, and that my kids could have a sense of belonging, because obviously they were the only black kids in that school. So I went to Yukon Archives, and I talked with Peggy Dorsey, who at the time was the archives librarian. And it was just one of these kind of synchronicitous situations. She had a file that she had labeled Hidden Histories, and she had been pulling photographs for years on that had pictures of black people and Asian people in them. And so she and I got to talking, and she ended up coming out to the school that my kids were going to and giving a presentation, and then every year during Black History Month, and which was something that we continued. Hi, welcome. And then, yeah, it grew from there. It was sort of, it's addictive. We had these pictures. For instance, if you look, this is one of my favorites. At this photo, it's from the Gold Rush period, from a little after, from 1914 in Dawson City. And there's a picture, you know, there's this woman standing here in a very fine silk dress with her little dog at a little distance from this other couple and their dog. And who is this woman? She is not, you know, a dance hall girl. She is not a waitress. She's wearing a very fine dress. So, and what's the story with these people? And is the distance just because of the little puppy? Or what is the story behind this? So there were dozens and dozens of these kinds of pictures that Peggy pulled. And it was like, my gosh, we've got to find out what these stories are. Because this kind of history, we thought, helps newcomers and people like my kids have a sense or feeling of belonging to the community, that they're not the first black people or Asian people to set foot in the Yukon or in Whitehorse or Dawson City, that people have been here for a century contributing to the fabric of Yukon society in very positive ways. So, you know, these pictures kept us going to find these stories and to be able to share these stories. So first of all, I guess after my little blurbo, Paul and I are kind of wondering, what is your interest in hidden histories? And maybe we could just go around the room, there's only a few of us, and what was your interest? Why were you interested in coming to this workshop or presentation?
And if I could just jump in, Charlotte, if anybody online has any interests that they like to share or any questions, feel free to post them in the chat and I'll read them out for Paul and Charlotte.
Thanks. Do you mind starting?
Yeah, sure. So I'm interested because I do think that there is a kind of dominant culture trend of telling maybe just one kind of story in the North. And I don't like it. So I'm excited just to learn about all the stories that we're not celebrating regularly as a society.
Mm-hmm.
That's my simplest way of putting that.
Great.
Hi. Sorry,
Hi.
I'm here.
That's okay.
Yeah, I saw the event posted a while back and it intrigued me. And little did I know that also Paul was going to be part of it. But it's interesting because I think we've had these conversations before as well around diversity in the North and what it is like in particular populations. Yeah, it's interesting to learn more about the history of it. Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
I was just about to ask, see if you wanted me to summarize some of the questions, the responses, but okay, all great. Thanks for coming.
Hello.
Welcome.
You're good.
Okay, great. I'm very curious to hear more about your organization, actually, and how you uncover and track down and learn about these stories. I think that's really fascinating.
Great.
So I'm
Yeah.
very curious to learn more about that. I hope you'll speak a little bit about that today.
I think we will. I think part of the outline is to sort of explain a little bit of how we, based on what Charlotte just started talking about in terms of finding images and, digging through files and research papers and poking at people or finding links to images or people and recording their narrative.
I'm interested in getting a more complete picture of the history of the Yukon. I also think it's very important that these stories are told, and I'm interested in your organization, what you do, and how you go about uncovering these stories. That's fine.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm interested in understanding how to make the city more representative moving forward. And through that thinking and through some of those conversations, I also realize it's important to understand how we think about the city looking backwards and what the narratives are about who we are as a city and the stories we tell, and stumbled upon your organization and read some of the communications that you'd put together, some of the research, and wanted to learn more about that. So thank you for hosting this today.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And online, we got feedback from Clea, who said that she's writing a Gold Rush novel. And Suki has an MA in history, and the focus was largely on the experience of marginalized people and on those whose voices aren't heard in a big H history, and is fascinated with untold stories. And because we didn't have the mic for the first two people in the audience, would you be able to paraphrase?
Yep, I think so, but I can't. I think you mentioned looking to expand the dominant narrative, and I'm not sure if it's just Whitehorse or Yukon, but I think that sort of, if anything, that's part of what we would like to do, is to expand the narrative of the historical narrative in Yukon. In terms of what we're going to be presenting today, I just thought of maybe give us a brief little outline about who we are, basically about the presentation. I know we don't have much time. I think we have about 30 minutes or something, so, and then maybe some time after for some Q&A. And so I think we're just going to sort of talk a little bit about who we are and what we do and why we do these things and how we go about, especially how we go about finding about creating and disseminating the information that we find. So I think Charlotte started off already with a little bit of who we are. We are a small group of individuals who are very curious, and curious because a lot of what we do see in the narrative for Yukon's history is predominantly one-sided. It is a cultural other, and it doesn't necessarily reflect a lot of minority groups like ourselves or like Charlotte's kids. And so our interest here is to try to add a bit more dimension and color, if anything, to the current narrative that's going around, or that is promoted, celebrated, and encouraged in the Yukon. If you ask anyone or look in or tourism guides and media advertisements, we're still pushing the gold rush theme as the adventure theme, which is fair enough. We also have a wilderness segment, but as well too, that sort of, you just look as a visual representation, that visual representation is quite one-sided as well too. There is some turning of that right now, but in terms of the historical narrative, there's always been ethno-cultural minorities here that have really contributed to, I guess, a colonial sort of narrative, which is heavily dependent on time, place, event, and it's his story, not necessarily the story of those who were either in the background that were making significant contributions and helped shape Yukon to where it is today.
Yeah, so we started, well, Peggy and I started really in 2001, and just attracted friends and shanghaied them into joining us. And once people start, it's kind of like being a detective, and it's very, very addictive to finding out who these stories are. And we're all really passionate about having the narrative change and about having it be more inclusive and diverse. And one of the things that got me going too was in 2000 I think it was 2000, down in Skagway at the visitor center there was a display of Black people in the history of Alaska. And I thought, oh wow, this is fantastic. And I got a hold of the person, his name was George Harper, and he came up here in 2001 and had a display up at the archives. And it was pictures that he'd been collecting for years and years and years about Black experience in Alaska mainly, and in the Dawson area. And he had a project called Blacks in Alaska History Project. So we weren't the first people to think of this idea up here in the north. So as we grew, first we were focusing mostly on Black history, and then we expanded to Asian history, because that too is not something that you see out there in the mainstream. If you look at all the tourist propaganda, like Paul said, it's all generally white faces, and that isn't the fact of the matter. The fact of the matter was it was extremely diverse. If you look at a few of these pictures that we have up, you'll see that that is true. Right. So yeah, that's about who we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just before we sort of go a little any further, I just wanted to also acknowledge too that May's Asian Heritage Month, for those who are not in the know, or just to acknowledge that as well too. And the theme for this year is about recognition, resilience, and resolve. And I just want to call that to attention because the Asian community in Canada has made significant contributions to where we are in Canadian culture, identity, and so forth. And a lot of that has been through a lot of perseverance. And I think not just us, but I think even the Canadian government has called for us for resolve to stand forward and fight anti-discrimination against Asian discrimination, and in light of the last several years following COVID. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and there's a lot of great programming and sponsored by the Canadian government, and I included one tonight that I think you can find some information on our Facebook page called, forgive me here, Sumugu, which means Weaving Our Stories, and it's a film produced by the Japanese-Canadian Association here in Yukon, and it'll be screened later tonight. It's a short film, but it'll be followed by a discussion panel of Chinese, Filipino, and the Indio community today. And they'll discuss their role of community and their contribution to Canadian society, and by helping their members to build a sense of identity. So it's great because that term, sense of identity, is very integral to why we matter, and why we're doing what we are doing. It's not necessarily, there is an educational component or an outreach component to what we do in terms of educating the public, but I think a lot of why we do this as well too is because diversity is one of these things that we don't necessarily have a choice in Yukon or anywhere. People are coming here of all different nationalities and religion, and that's going to happen. Whether or not you choose to accept them or not, that's another thing, and that's the inclusion part. Inclusion is a choice. And if you don't choose to accept them, then, you know, you could be well, I think you pretty much know what happens at that point. You could be accused of being racist of some sort, but I think it would be a lot more harmonious society if we learn to include each other's differences, or accept them, or learn to negotiate and discuss controversial or tough subject matters.
Okay, so maybe we should get on with what we do and how we do it.
Yeah.
And this is, we feel it's important work. And like you, I mean, you might ask, well, what is my kids are grown up, they've left home, why am I still involved with this? It's, well, because I think it's really important that as a white person, I'm interested in other people's stories, you know, in everybody's stories, and having an inclusive version of history. So, over to you.
Okay, so what we do, mostly what we do in terms of trying to increase the, trying to add some color and dimension to the dominant narrative is three main things. We research, we interpret, and we disseminate. And so the research component, really, it's a little interesting in how that thing comes about. One is mostly our members who are really curious, or just ends up with some strange images that they either find on their desk or looking through archival material. Now, it's also partly based on time, how we can sort of move forward with some of this history. For example, Charlotte showed you some images of this black woman during the during the gold rush period, and there's a few others around as well too. Those types of imagery definitely does pique our curiosity to look for more, but we realize also that we're limited in terms of where we can find information on them. They are absolutely unidentified when we get these images. Some may have a caption on them, but a lot of them don't. And so any kind of leads that we might have, they just don't go anywhere. So it's a bit of a struggle. We do have a few breakthroughs here and there, and I'll let Charlotte talk about a little bit of that one in a second. But then we're now trying to shift a lot of our focus more on research items that are, or individuals or groups that are a little not too far distant. Mostly because people are still alive that we can actually physically get in touch with, like family members or people who know people and speak to them directly and sort of collect some information about them. Otherwise, like the Klondike period, there's very little information on minority groups developing communities elsewhere. Again, the narrative back then was his story, not necessarily the minority's story.
So in our group, we have a couple of really crack researchers, and particularly Peggy Dorsey. She is amazing. She's just always on the lookout and combing old newspapers and old files and old archives around the country and in the States. She's just an amazing researcher. So without her, I don't think we would have uncovered as much as we have. So once we've got that, then we decided, well, we need to be able to present this to the public. How are we going to get this out there? So we do presentations. We've created panels like these. These are just a few of the panels we've created on particular people or families. We've had events in the past during Black History Month and Asian Heritage Month that have ranged from, you know, big sort of events to a CBC on-air book panel to displays in Mac's Fireweed Window, all sorts of things like that. But we are small. It's kind of a niche sort of thing. You can be interested in issues around oppression and diversity, et cetera, but not necessarily interested in history. So it's kind of a niche to have people who are interested in history plus exploring histories that have been hidden or not celebrated as widely. So we decided recently that we were going to back away from the events because it was just too exhausting. First to find the money and then to find something new again to present every single solitary year. So we feel too that there's other organizations in the community now that can take this on. When we first started, there really was nobody else that was doing anything during these months, so we figured we needed to do something about that. So, yeah. So, and an example of something super interesting, like as Paul said, the gold rush period, well, it's really hard to find out information. But here we have these intriguing photos, and you can't see them very clearly, but I'll put them up afterwards. This is a man that was only identified as Black Prince. And we knew he worked at the Monte Carlo Hotel, and here's a picture of him. It was a midnight photo taken at midnight, you know, one of these pictures they used to do during the Klondike. And all these white people down below, and here's Black Prince up hanging out of the window. He was not going to be excluded from this photo. So we've always been really curious about him, but just ran up into just dead ends. We couldn't find out anything more. And then fairly recently, was it Peggy or you?
I got a call from a CBC producer who had some resources. I'm not sure how she came about it, but she led me on to a Vice website that sort of gave more background information on who he is. And so his real name is Peter Jackson, and it turns out he was an Australian prize fighter. He was an Australian prize fighter that was a prize fighter and a Shakespearean actor. He just didn't do one thing. He recognized early in his career that his boxing career was going to be short, but he became a very well-versed Shakespearean actor. But the interesting thing is, so he traveled, this was somewhere late 19th century, 1886, somewhere around there. He traveled the world in search of like the world heavyweight championship, but was frequently denied the championship. He was undisputed. He won every fight. He won every fight with the current title holder, but they never put the title on the line every time they fought him. And so I think there might have been 8 fighters at the time that had titles that he fought, won them, but they never had made it a title match. So he never won, like the title itself, but he's basically undefeated. I think after a while, his boxing career was coming to an end, and he decided to come up north. Thought he'd make some more money entertaining minors as a boxer and in the theater. And then that only lasted about 2-3 years before he came down with tuberculosis. And it turned out that the community, he was well known and liked in the community. They actually raised enough funds for him to go back to Australia, and he shortly thereafter passed away. I think he was about 38 or 40, so that was quite young. Yep. So interesting, that was out of nothing. We were stumped for years, and then we sometimes get leads like that, or a family member shows up, or can fill in some of the gaps for us.
Yeah, so it's luck. It's a lot of it is sheer dumb luck, who we can explore. And then we also decided a few years ago, as Paul said, to try and concentrate rather than on the distant past with these, intriguing threads, but leading nowhere, to people who have contributed to the community since, say, the 50s or so, or the 40s. So that's what we're doing. And we rely on, we're all volunteers. We all have other jobs or volunteer commitments, and so we rely on trying to get government grants to hire Peggy, for instance, to do research, or someone else to do research on particular people that we've identified in the community. So that's a bit of you never know whether you're going to get the grant or not. So yeah, we don't have any core funding or anything like that. We operate on a shoestring.
Yeah, so. We definitely do. We are at the hands and mercies pretty much of a lot of government funding for, as Charlotte mentioned, for archivists or historians and writers who could easily, for example, we have several pop-ups here that we brought as sort of items of how we disseminate some of the items, some of the findings that we have managed to uncover. They're not, being a pop-up in 2 languages, they're not the full history. It's just more of a concise summary, but it's an easy way for us to be able to circulate some of the displays and circulate some of our findings with the general public. In terms of other types of dissemination methods that we've had various sort of contacts with writers. Lawrence Hill's a popular one that we've contributed on several occasions with. And I think he's currently working on a book on the Alaska Highway. That was another tidbit of history that a lot of Yukoners don't necessarily know about, is that 35% of the soldiers that built the Alaska Highway were black soldiers from the Deep South. And we do have a lot more information on them as well too. And various consultations with either heritage boards or school groups in terms of how we sort of share some of this information, or how we can actually help the community bring to light some of these characters or individuals and groups.
We'd like to try and get something into the curriculum, but we haven't had any success with that so far. Does anybody have any questions? Any questions from the online audience?
We do have some comments from the online audience. I want to start. I missed the chance to read out John Glenn Morris's message when he was talking about his interest in hidden histories. And he wanted to say, my interest is because stories are powerful. They can bring us together or pull us apart. My hope is, of course, the latter. How do we approach identity as expansive possibilities versus zero-sum thinking that's easily triggered and can be destructive in a world full of polarization? And he also adds, I am optimistic.
I think that's a whole nother presentation, John.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many questions are in that one. I want to add a couple things to that question and the idea of hope. In terms of, again, addressing kind of what we do, I just want to, there's one thing about history that I want to emphasize, that a lot of us don't think of history, or you ask somebody in town, or you see somebody and say history, let's talk about history, and the eyes might start rolling, or yawns just automatically start coming on people's faces. And what people tend to think about is a very, very strict narrative of date, time, event, and specific person. The reason these histories matter to us more is because they are our stories. They're more, they are part of a different type of a historical narrative. They are stories of, again, the people that we just take for granted or were taken for granted. And it's their lived experiences that we want to capture, not necessarily the experiences of what mattered as a historical narrative to some degree. So in sharing these stories with the general public, the hope is that we can actually look beyond what I guess the sort of rigid narrative of history is, and look at people a little differently. Not necessarily striving, I mean, we kind of live in a world of have and have-nots, and we all sort of value trying to get ahead of everyone, and we somewhat forget who the other people are. We forget who the bus driver or the domestic worker is that's really keeping things going, and we're all striving to get to the top, and we forget about who's on the bottom rung. And I think it's time that we start acknowledging some of these people in our communities that really, you know, make a difference. If they weren't there today, well, I'm not sure where we'd be. I mean, look at the pandemic right now. As when we talk about essential workers, the majority of essential workers out there right now are the ones that are probably most vulnerable to COVID as well, too. The most ones that are underpaid, underrepresented, marginalized. And it's time that we actually really start paying attention to acknowledging the contributions that they do make to society.
So with that, we'll just segue into some of the people that we've profiled. And one of my absolute favorite people is a woman named Lucille Hunter. And this panel is on the Hunter family. So Lucille, to me, she was just an incredibly intrepid, adventuresome, and amazing woman. She was born in 1878 in Illinois, and she and her husband Charles came over the horrible Stickeen Trail in 1898. Well, in 1897 they started their journey, which was only 32 years after the abolition of slavery. We don't know the backstory behind Lucille and Charles, but one of my assumptions is that they came north for the very same reasons as everybody else, adventure and the hope for gold. But I also think that for a black person coming from the States at that time, they would have been trying to get away from all the Jim Crow laws that had been passed and were being passed. So they took the arduous Stickeen route, which was supposed to be easier, but of the 7,000 people who attempted the Stickeen route from Wrangell to Glenora, half did not make it. So that tells you something about her and her husband. And at the time, she was 19 years old and pregnant. So she gave birth to her daughter Teslin in Teslin. And in 1897, in November. And then they stayed, I think they stayed a month in Teslin, and then they went on to Atlin with a newborn baby. And they stayed there for Christmas and learned how to mush dogs, because I don't think they would have been doing that in the States. And then they mushed on in January with this newborn baby up to Dawson City. And there they were able to stake claims, gold and silver claims, plus they had other businesses as well. While Lucille did some laundry, she did some nannying. They did whatever they needed to stay alive, but they were able to purchase mining claims, which they would not have been able to do in the southern states. So here's a picture of, up here there's Teslin at a picnic, and this is a picture of Lucille. It's the youngest picture we have of her from at Scroggie Roadhouse at about 1918. We don't have any other pictures of her in her youth. So her daughter Teslin went to school in Dawson City and then was sent out to Seattle for further education. And there she met a Danish fisherman named Carl Sorensen, and she had a child who's nicknamed Buster. Unfortunately, she had a second pregnancy, and unfortunately, she did not survive childbirth, nor did the child. And so Buster, Louise came down, and Buster was taken back up to Dawson City and was raised by his grandparents. So here's a picture of Buster in 1930. In 1935, working in the gold fields. He did join the Second World War, joined the Royal Canadian Hussars Reconnaissance Regiment. So he took part in World War II. After the war, he came back to Dawson, but for whatever reasons, he didn't stay, and he ended up in Haida Gwaii and married a Haida Gwaii woman, and his descendants lived there. And a number of years ago, his great-great-granddaughter, we got in touch with his great-great-granddaughter, and she came up to Whitehorse, and we had a really good visit. And yeah, so back to Louise, or Lucille. Lucille, Charles died in 1939. And Lucille kept her 3 claims in the Klondike and a silver claim in the Mayo District. But she did not drive. So she walked from Dawson to Mayo and Keno to check on her claims there. And she was evidently just an amazing woman. She was on top of everything. She was always trying to pull one over on the mining inspectors. She was a very canny sort of person. So she managed the claims herself, and she hired workers to work for her. So this would have been something during those times. And Buster worked as a miner. So Dawson shrank by the time of the Second World War, so they decided to move to Whitehorse, where Lucille lived the rest of her life. And she operated a laundry here, and Buster did deliveries for her. And she lost her sight, and she was living in this cabin. We have a picture somewhere, surrounded by all sorts of books and papers. She was really interested in the world, and she used to listen to broadcasts on the shortwave radio, and when people visit her, she would engage in really lively discussions with them. She was known as quite an interesting person. Plus, she loved kids, and she would spoil all the kids in the neighborhood with candies and cookies and things. And there are people alive today who remember her, which is quite interesting. So she died so she had this little wood stove, just one of those tin can type wood stoves, prospector style, in her cabin. And people were always warning her, you've got to clean your place up because it's gonna catch fire. And it did catch fire. Luckily, a neighbor was there and managed to pull her out, but she lost everything. So, and she was blind at the time too, so you can imagine how terrifying that must have been. So neighbors helped her out and got her an apartment, and then her health was failing, so she ended up in the hospital, and she died in 1972, and she's buried up in the Grey Mountain Cemetery in the Yukon Order of Pioneer plot, which is a really big thing. If you know any of the history of the Yukon Order of Pioneers, they did not admit women. So for her to have been buried in their plot says a lot. So you can go up and visit her gravesite anytime you want. So, I mean, what an incredible woman. I would have loved to have known her. She's just amazing. So, yeah, that's one of the people that we're able to find out quite a bit of information on, and are really happy to share her history. She's also been included in a couple of, one anthology for children on women's stories that haven't been heard in history, Canadian history. There was a filmmaker from the UK contacted us at one point I don't know what happened with that. So
many of these profiles, I mean, we've done quite a few profiles, or are in the process of developing a few more profiles. And they're available on our website at www.hhsy.org. There's a profile selection there, and you can go through and find out more information about these people and groups. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I thought 15 minutes? Okay. I thought maybe I can talk a little bit, just briefly, about a couple other display panels that we have here, not visible up front, as the Philpotts family, and I'm just going to speak a little briefly about them, and then maybe a few other people as well too, or take a few more questions. But that's an interesting story for me. I have the joy of meeting Reverend Philpotts several years ago. He passed away in, I think, 2017. But the Philpotts family came from Joshua and Yvonne Philpotts were Jamaican missionaries that came to Yukon in 1965, straight from Jamaica to Watson Lake, to serve the community. Joshua was a minister at the St. John's Baptist Church, while his wife Yvonne worked at the nurses' station in Watson Lake. They both traveled regularly. Joshua mostly traveled a lot to a lot of the communities for services, to Kangta and to the Northwest Territories. He was president of the Home and School Association in Watson Lake, and he was instrumental in promoting and getting First Nations children integrated into the school system in the Yukon at the time as well too. Yvonne was a midwife, a nurse, and she must have birthed somewhere over 200 children in the area at the time. She was very fondly remembered. I think there were several children named after her in her honor for birthing. And they moved to Whitehorse in 1970, where Joshua was appointed associate priest at Christ Church Cathedral and pastor of the communities along the North Alaska Highway to the border. And in 1975, they moved away to Alberta, where Joshua continued pastoral services and various other volunteer duties in Alberta. So a couple years ago, we produced an oral history book, 2017 or 2015, I believe. We produced an oral history book or guidebook to help those that are interested in capturing whether or not it's their community's oral history or your individual oral history. And in celebration of that, it coincided with Black History Month. So on the launch, we invited Joshua Philpotts up, and we had the pleasure of being in his company of sorts. He's a very oratory type of fellow, just outgoing, boisterous, full of stories, and captivating and charming as hell. And it was a full pleasure to get to know him for the brief period of time. He passed away a year and a half later, which was very sad, but we were very fortunate to have recorded with him various stories which we would like to later share with the general public in terms of his experiences not growing up, but living in Watson Lake and living in the Whitehorse community at the time. Now, it's important to note that Joshua and Yvonne, this is what they wanted to do. Missionary work was what they wanted to do before they met. He was trained as a millwright, a carpenter, I'm not sure, just general handy guy, and with the idea that they would be able to roam around to any community or any place that needed help after floods or storms or in need of church services to help those communities. And so the opportunity for him to come north stemmed from a visit to Toronto, and then next thing you know, they were living in Watson Lake in 1965. So it's a very interesting story, and he's a very interesting character. And yeah, he's just one of many intrepid minorities or ethno-cultural individuals that has lived here and has some really interesting stories about his time here. And we'd like to be able to share more of those stories with you.
Yeah, another person more recently, in more recent history, is Socorro Alfonso. She was the first Filipino woman to come to the Yukon. She was born in 1950 in the Philippines and had a very hard life. The name she was given, Socorro, means help in Spanish. So her family sort of set her up for the kind of person that she would be and the kind of work that she did for the rest of her life. Her beginnings were very humble. She came from a farming and fishing family, but they moved to another community so that their children could attend school. But life was really hard. There were 9 kids, so that makes it really hard. So at 12 years old, she went to live with cousins in Manila, working as domestic help to earn tuition to go to high school, because of course their high school isn't free at the time. So 4 years later, her mother died, so she went home to help her father. So then she returned to Manila and worked for low wages in the government, constantly moving between relatives' homes. She joined a Catholic church there and found it a great source of comfort and inspiration. And then after 10 years, she seized an opportunity to go to Singapore to do domestic work. And there's a picture here of the family that she worked for. It was a retired British officer named Frederick Minns, whose wife was very ill, so she came to help him out. And then after he died, she needed to find other employment, and the Yukon beckoned. And so she found a position as a nanny here in the Yukon and worked for several families who have only the highest praise for her. She was a person who helped others throughout her life in the community and in the places where she worked. I'll go over here again, I guess, because I'm kind of stuck in the corner there. And she helped any, so at the time too, it was fairly common for a number of wealthy families in the Yukon to bring Filipino nannies over. And she was very, very instrumental in helping them integrate into the community and to create a community of Filipino people here in the Yukon. And she ended her career working at Macaulay Lodge until she retired in 2014. Her health was not great. But she was a lovely, lovely woman that everyone who speaks of her or who knew her just speaks most highly of how she was caring, generous, and kind to everyone. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2017, and in the Philippines. She had gone back to the Philippines. But what was really one thing that was sort of gratifying for us as a group was when they had the memorial service for her here, her celebration of life, they asked if they could, the friends that were like family to her here, asked if they could use the panel that we had created at her service. So that really felt good to us that we were able to provide the information to the community about this wonderful woman, but also to contribute to her memorial and to contribute to, in a way that felt good for the family and or friends. So we have another panel over there, but we probably don't have time to talk about Joe Tsukamoto.
Yep. Yeah. Is there any questions that anybody's got any questions that we can answer in the next 5 minutes or so?
I can get us started with some online. We have a little bit of a backlog here, but I think I'll start with Clea Roberts' question because it seems most relevant to what you were just talking about. Do you know why the dominant culture promoting / mobilizing for the Klondike Gold Rush were more intent on keeping out Asian people than during other gold rushes? I mean, it's racism for sure, but what was the specific fear?
Well,
Whew.
yeah, that's
I think it was just the general horrible phrase, the yellow peril, that I don't know where that comes from, really. I don't know, because I suppose Asian cultures are so very, very different than European cultures. People look very different than European cultures. And it's that sense of those are the others. And some in the history of Japan, Japan was not interested in having European visitors or becoming, I don't know what the word is, but they had laws that kept Japan to itself and prevented Europeans from coming into Japan. So maybe some of that, so people didn't know anything about Japan. It was very much the others. So I can't really answer the question any more fully than that. How about you, Paul?
No, I can't. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors at play at that other than just the racism, for sure. I mean, it's the other part of that for me is sovereignty as well too. It's to protect white land, white territory, white dominance. This is our land, so you work for us, not the other way around. We want control. That's but that was an interesting time frame where I think definitely the overall racism was probably the main factor there. Yeah.
I think if I can read into Clea's question a little bit more, I think the interesting part is that in the gold rushes down south, racism towards Asians took a very different perspective. They were using Asians as cheap labor, whereas up here, we were just trying to keep Asians out.
But there were Asian people. We have lots of pictures from the Gold Rush era of Asian people.
Mm-hmm.
South Asian and Chinese and Japanese.
You know, a lot, and it's again too, to contribute to that as well too. There was not just allowing Asians, but it was very much similar as well too with the military as well too, to some degree. Blacks were kept separated from villages or any other kind of communities for fear that they would populate somehow or get together with the people there and create a mutant, Mongoloids or anything like that. But and then to also speak to the displacement of all the First Nations people here on their traditional territory as well too. So there was just from an ethical, morally standpoint, I wouldn't say that was the best period in our history timeline. It was a history of dominance and for one specific race. Which, and just to add to that a little bit, it's I suppose to some degree, on a race level, I don't believe white people, and I'm just generalizing. I'm not necessarily pointing at you, but in terms of identifying or discussing race issues, whites generally don't think of themselves as a race. Like, you don't walk around saying, "I'm a white guy," "I'm a white girl," or "that white guy over there." It's often you identify somebody else as a different color because I think the narrative or the dominant socialized aspect for a white person is I'm normal, where everyone else is a measure to me. and so I think that still plays to that question to some degree, and still today a little bit, today's narrative as well. It's still that, well, everybody else measures up to me as a white person. So yeah, anyway.
One interesting thing, though, was during the era of the Second World War, when Japanese Canadians were being deported, taken away from the coast and sent to the prairies, etc., into internment camps and made to carry passes. Evidently here in the Yukon, there were a few Japanese Canadian people or Japanese nationals who had to carry their cards, but nobody seemed to care, and nobody deported them anywhere. So it was just, there seemed to have been a little more tolerance or towards Asian people here in the Yukon at that time.
And there's a couple of comments online that suggest a couple of historical reasons behind it. The recession of the 1890s, and also the fact that Chinese people were no longer needed to build the railway towards the end of the 19th century. So I do have another question from Claire, but I'm wondering if there's any questions in the room. Okay. Claire was just interested in what obstacles you've encountered with integrating Hidden Histories material into the Yukon curriculum.
Well, we haven't managed to do it.
Obstacles.
I think in some senses it's a question for the Department of Education of priorities. They've been really super busy trying to integrate First Nations histories and cultures into the curriculum in the Yukon. So I think other histories have taken kind of a back seat to that so far.
Yeah, I'm partly mixed on, partly thinking every government that we've had for the last little while has had very little interest in the idea of looking at inclusivity and broadening what it means, especially in this community. Again, it's like, I think I've been here about 23 years. I was one of the first early black people, but I've seen this community become a lot more diverse. But I like people that I encounter and see. But I don't see any of that necessarily reflected in any of the materials, like for, I guess, you know, to some degree, when you would think the first line of inclusion or demonstrating acceptance or trying to get people on board is through an education system. Like, for example, my daughter now, who's about 6 years old, if I go to her school, the playground it's a salad bowl. It's great to see, but I don't necessarily see anything in the curriculum that actually tailors to them or represents them as a demographic. It's still the narratives from whenever, the 70s or 80s, or that they're still being taught. I don't see very much in terms being developed to have an inclusivity program here in the Yukon. Whether or not on the municipal level, I know that it's been pitched for a racialized coalition board here. That's been often rejected. I don't see that on the municipal level, and I don't see that on the territorial level either. I partly feel the government just doesn't, well, it's not the priority. You know, the Inclusivity Act here, I feel like in the Yukon, comes down to reconciliation. It comes down to a job application as to whether or not, what tick box do you have on the job application form? Are you a First Nations minority? Yes, that's inclusivity, all right, right on, excellent. I'm a First Nations minority. Doesn't take into consideration any other ethnic groups whatsoever. What else are they doing? Oh, you have a signature in the bottom of your email that says you acknowledge the traditional territories of the First Nations that have been displaced. Excellent. Is that our best that we can do? It seems like it is. Well, I'm going to say that jokingly, but it's kind of, I partly feel it's partly shameful. I don't think the government, I think there's a lack of interest from those in the education department. Probably a historical department as well too, to try and push for a bit more inclusivity in the workplace, in the school place, or just generally for Yukon.
When my kids were young, I did an awful lot of research on Black history in Canada. I wanted to try and get the school to celebrate positive stories about Black people, because what do you hear? You hear about slavery, you hear about racism, you hear about all the oppression, which is, I mean, it's necessary, that has to happen, but also we don't celebrate the beautiful, wonderful stories of the contributions that Black people have made to this country. And so I amassed a whole swack of material, and I would go into my kids' school, they welcomed me then, to talk about, you know, the inventors who invented all sorts of things that we use today, the people who did intrepid things, who contributed to society in economic, scientific, cultural ways. And after my kids left that school, they still did some things during Black History Month, but I never was able to make any headway into the department to say, look, I've got all this material, can't, you know, use it with other teachers. Some teachers would invite us in during Black History Month, always during Black History Month, to give presentations. One time I did a talk, myself and another member, for a teachers' convention on, you know, the kinds of things that they might be able to do in their classrooms to be more celebratory of diversity and the diverse contributions of Canadians who were Black or Asian or whomever. But it never went beyond that, which is really hard. And, you know, as a group, we've sort of struggled with, okay, let's see if we can find some money and hire a curriculum developer and come up with a curriculum and try and get it in the schools. And then a couple of years ago, there's a group in Vancouver called Landscapes of Injustice, and it's about the history of Japanese Canadians on the West Coast and the internment, et cetera, loss of property. And they've developed a wonderful curriculum for grade 3, I believe it is, 3 and 6. 3 to 5, yep. Yeah. Yep. So we had a member of Landscapes of Injustice up here to give a presentation that went over really well, and then we tried to get meetings with the department, which didn't pan out. And, you know, we have tried to make further. We've talked to the department a couple of times about meeting and could we use that curriculum up here, because it's ready just to plug in, but we haven't met with success there either. And I think, and to be fair, I think part of that is because they are really trying to indigenize the curriculum, and they can only do so much at once. But as somebody who's been trying to push this agenda for a very long time, it is frustrating.
Okay, we've gone a little over time. It's been a great discussion, though. I'm going to leave the Zoom channel open for about 10 minutes in case anyone else wants to share any comments with each other. But thank you, Paul and Charlotte. Do you have any last closing statements that you want to make?
Yes, our annual general meeting is on June 10th at 12:30. We're not sure the venue right as yet, but part of it will be Zoom accessible. So I hope you all come out and join us. There's some material on the back table there and these photos around the room that you're more than welcome to look at. And thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for caring. Yep.
And if there's any more information that you'd like, I mean, please do check out our website as well too. It's still in progress, but there's a lot of information there. I think that can help feed your curiosity or help share the information or become more engaged in the community. And yeah, we look forward to building a community here in Whitehorse by representing, I think, a small segment of the community that's, you know, of minority descent. So it's www.hhsy.org.
Excellent. Thank you again to Paul and Charlotte. Just a reminder to everybody that we try to do one of these talks about once a month. So sign up for our newsletter. You can find that at the bottom of our webpage. Also, sign up to Facebook, watch our events page. Those are all great ways to stay on top of great events like this. And again, these are only possible because we have such great volunteers who are willing to come in and give talks like this. So if anybody has a talk that they think would be great for a lunch and learn, then please reach out to us. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to see you next month.
Thank you.